It is my absolute honor to announce the final event of our educational program for today, which is this absolutely fantastic panel. It's a very special panel, which you will hear more about in a little bit, I'm sure. I'm so glad that you guys are here, that you're still here, that you're still with us, still awake, still fit. You look a lot better than I'm feeling right now. It's been a long day. So with that, I'll give over to Rebecca, and I will go get myself a beer or something. And Rebecca, please come on stage. I really look forward to this panel.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. I am back. What a surprise. I'm really happy to be back and to be in your company for this last panel of the day with my esteemed panelists that I'm so very much looking forward to speaking to with some surprise questions that I'm sure you're going to enjoy, all of you. So our final session of the day about MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. We've heard a lot about it today with Rick Doblin's talk earlier on. So we're going to be able to dive in, but it's going to be a different type of panel this time, you know? We're going to be asking them some interesting questions. So I'm just going to take my seat, and we're going to start. So the only person on this panel that you might not have met yet is Rabia. And Rabia, I'm not going to tell you too much about Rabia. She's sort of my guest here that's going to, it's going to be interesting to see how each and every one of the people here in this panel are connected. So there's Dr. Mithoefer, there's Rabia, Dr. Oehen, and there's Rick Doblin on this panel. So Rabia has been a patient of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And Rabia, I have my first question for you, and for all of you, because all of you will need to respond to this question. You know, do they seem connected in some way? What would you say? Come on, energy levels. I'm going to have to do this again. Everybody get up, get up, get up. Everybody stand up. I know Morton didn't want to give you the exercise, but we're going to have to do this exercise. I need the energy, folks. I need the energy. Woo! Yes, I need the energy. Up and down, up and down. You're not doing it. Please do it. Up and down, everybody. Oh, that's excellent. Okay, great. Okay, let's all sit down again. I'm going to ask you the same question again. So, folks, do you think that these people on the panel are connected in some way? Yes. Great. I want it louder, though. Do you think that they're connected in some way? Yes. At the top of your lungs, folks. Come on. Yes, that type of thing. Excellent. So, Rabia, my first question to you is, how are you all connected?
Thank you for your question, and thank you for having me here. So, how I'm connected to Rick and Peter is the following. So 5 years ago, I attended the Oslo Freedom Forum in Norway, where there was a conference on international human rights defenders, journalists, activists, who were all brought together by the Human Rights Foundation. Those people who were there were either working at high-risk countries or previously received threats or were even previously detained. And one of the sessions that I attended was Rick present, and Rick provided a presentation about MAPS, as well as the benefits of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. Now, it's important to say that as I never heard of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy before, even though I'm a former police officer, I do know all the types of drugs, but I never heard of the therapy itself. So for me, I was really interested and eager to learn more. And at that moment, I really wanted to speak to Rick, particularly after he said that the PTSD clinical trials in the United States improved the lives of many people, including the veterans. So I approached Rick, and I told him about my situation. I told him I was suffering. I told him I was living in Switzerland. And Rick's response was, "You're really lucky you live in Switzerland." Why? And he said, well, Switzerland is the only country so far that uses MDMA legally as part of the so-called limited use. So I got more interested, and I explained him that classic therapy did not help me, not in Belgium, not in the United States, and not in Canada. And I was eager to really pursue this therapy. So Rick inspired me, and that's how he referred me to Dr. Peter Oehen, who gladly took me as one of his last patients before he retired. So this is a connection.
Yes, this is an incredible connection. And I would love for each and every one of the panelists to talk to this connection. I'd love to understand your perspective, you know, in this relationship, in this connection that started with you, Rick, you know, and Rabia. And I want you to explain to me how you experienced this connection, every single one of you.
Okay, well, one of the things I'm most proud of is that we do have a program, formal and informal, with human rights activists that we refer to therapists, because so many of them are traumatized by the work that they do. And so Thor Halvorsen, who's the founder of the Human Rights Foundation, brought me to the Oslo Freedom Forum to speak about MDMA, to give hope for a lot of the human rights activists. But how we're all connected, I think we've all seen the healing potential of psychedelics, and we've all wanted to move it up from the underground. Michael and I, our connection was, Michael was a member of MAPS before we met each other, and he'd also worked with Stan Groff in the holotropic breathwork training, as had I. And Michael approached me in 2000 at the world's first conference on ayahuasca, organized by Ralph Metzner in San Francisco. And you saw that at the end I showed this slide about the island and this utopia that Aldous Huxley described, this psychedelic utopia that was in the end crushed by the oil companies. So Michael had just come from St. Kitts, an island in the Caribbean, where a woman, Deborah Mash, had an Ibogaine clinic, and one of Michael's patients wanted to go to therapy for Ibogaine, and Michael said that would be okay, but he wanted to go along and see how it worked. And so Michael first approached me and said, you know, let's see what we can do about setting up some clinic somewhere in the world where we could bring people for therapy. And so my first thought was, I'm totally not interested in that. I think now the FDA is opening up, let's try to go to the heart of the system. And within 15 minutes, we'd formed a partnership, and that was 23 years ago.
Wow.
And then through that work, well, actually well before I'd met Michael, Peter and I had met from the pioneering work that was done here in Switzerland with the researchers, and the compassionate use from 88 to 93, shut down in 93 because, well, I don't know if you want to tell the story, but one of the therapists went off to do a group in France.
I want to hear the story.
Oh, you haven't heard? Well, one of the Swiss therapists went off to do a group in France, and someone died related to Ibogaine, and that brought it to light, and then that shut things down here as well. But through this work, you know, we were very inspired in the U.S. because when we were shut down, there was still work with MDMA that was able to start here. In part, I said, because of the WHO, this little footnote, when they criminalized MDMA, they said they were worried that it would block research, and they encouraged nations of the world to facilitate research into this most interesting substance. And Peter and others connected to the SEP were able to get permission to do compassionate use, so that's how we met. And then Peter was interested in doing therapy, and we did one of our phase 2 studies together.
It's such an exciting story. And Michael?
Yeah, I would say I experience it as gratitude mostly. I mean, it's, you know, little did I know when I had that first conversation with Rick where it was going to go. And it's been an incredible journey. You know, it feels to me now like it's a project that a few friends of mine and I started 25 years ago, and here we are. So it's been that's been part of the joy of it for me. I mean, Rick and I seem to have a similar delusion, which turned out to be not a delusion, because you know, a lot of times people ask, did you think you were going to get approval? And you know, rationally, we knew it was quite possible we would never be able to pull this off. But I don't think either of us ever seriously considered that. It was just like so obvious that this was the thing to do. So it's been a great joy. And then Peter and Verena reached out a couple of years later, and we've gotten to be such good friends. And then, you know, I feel a connection to you because the team and that you were treated by came to our training in the Netherlands. And so I love those people too. So it feels, what a privilege to be connected in that way.
So I met Rick Doblin at a conference. I don't know when it was, in the 80s sometimes, but then the time of permission came in Switzerland, and after where I had received my training in psychedelic therapy. And when it was shut down, there was full despair for all of us in the SAPT. And we finally, after years, decided to get into research, but we simply did not have the knowledge and the resources to perform research. And when MAPS got got full permission for the first trial, we decided to visit you and Michael, my wife Verena and I, and asked you if we could perform a trial in Switzerland under MAPS supervision or monitoring or sponsoring. Yeah, so that's how we met. And during this visit, we also visited Michael and Annie Mithoefer in Charleston then. We became friends, and well, that's how we are connected. And the connection takes funny turns. We were, a few years ago, sitting in a restaurant at the Bodensee when Verena and I looked out the window, and who was coming from the boat? Michael and Annie Mithoefer. So now we meet outside the scientific areas also when Mithoefers visit or are on holidays at the Bodensee.
Yeah, there seems to be something going on here that we don't quite understand.
Yeah, right, yeah.
I just love the energy that I'm feeling here on stage, just the friendship and the rapport between you all. It's really beautiful, and I hope that the audience can really feel this. It really is very strong. I do have another question for you, and I guess it's just a typical Rebecca question, but it's a little bit of a scenario. So there are two parts to this question. The first part is, if you were shipwrecked and stranded, you gave me the idea for this, Rick, stranded on an island, what psychedelic would you take with you? So you're alone on this island. That's the first part of the question.
Okay, well, if I were stranded on a deserted island all by myself and can only have one psychedelic, it would be LSD. And the reason is because there's a way in which you can negotiate with MDMA. If there's something difficult that's coming up, you have this ability to push it away if you're not quite ready. Maybe it'll come back later. But you can maneuver to some extent. But with LSD, you just have to surrender. There's no real ability to push stuff away. You really just... And so I feel that if I could only have one psychedelic, I'd want one that would bring things to me that I might not feel ready to see or didn't want to see. Mm-hmm. And so also LSD, you can do so much at different doses. So it's like a range of different drugs almost, depending on the dose. So LSD would be the one I would take with. Okay. Now, I did say also that if I was stranded on a deserted island with my...
That's the second part of the question. We can't tell them that part, not yet.
I won't say it.
Yeah, okay. Peter? Yeah. If you were stranded,
well,
yes.
I like the LSD choice because I think low-dose LSD has a lot of similarities to MDMA. But I'd rather take the Yost bypass because even though I consider MDMA to be a psychedelic, like he said yesterday, you could say MDMA plus one psychedelic. So I'd say MDMA plus LSD.
Yes, Peter.
Well, if I was stranded, I would look if somebody else was stranded too. So, and we would split. I'd take the LSD and the other could take the MDMA. So, the best of both. But if I were alone, the same for me, LSD, for the same reasons. LSD has for me the same properties as MDMA, and it has the same properties because I was primed by MDMA. I learned to center in the heart, and I can do this on MDMA, on LSD too. So I have the best of both. A wide spectrum from LSD and the centering of the heart from MDMA.
Thank you so much. And Rabia?
Well, since I only had MDMA as part of my therapy, I would go for MDMA, of course.
Okay. Makes
It's
perfect sense.
Exactly.
So the second part of the question that Peter has sort of, responded to is if you were stranded on the same island, but with your significant other or the love of your life, what psychedelic would you like to have then?
Well, I would say that my wife and I just celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary, and we take MDMA together once a year or so, and it's been tremendously helpful. So if it was just me and her, yes, for sure it would be MDMA.
Okay. Thank you so much.
I don't want to one-up Rick, but a few years ago we celebrated our 50th anniversary. And I would go with MDMA too.
Well, for me it would be LSD. Yeah.
I don't have a partner, so I haven't used it yet with someone, but I would go still for MDMA.
Okay. That absolutely makes sense. So I do have another question, and it's about the advice that you would give, if you were to offer some advice to professionals and students that want to pursue a career in MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, what type of advice would you give them?
Do your own work first, and if possible, have your own psychedelic experiences. And holotropic breath work is also a powerful way to prepare. So I think that's the most important thing. What we try to, in our trainings, we try to teach people about this non-directive approach or inner-directed approach. But the main thing that we can't teach them is their ability to be present in intense situations. And for me, for that, it requires your own work, which is not a one-shot deal. I think it's an ongoing responsibility and an important part of it.
Well, the first question I would ask people is, are they interested in becoming a medical doctor or a therapist? And is it important to them that they have the power to prescribe or not? Okay. And I would say then the next part is that in order to get the power to prescribe, a lot of the education you're going to get is going to have nothing to do with being a psychedelic therapist. Years and years of work will be just to have the power to prescribe. But sometimes people want that. But I would then generally say, probably better to just study psychology and find a doctor or someone that you could work with that will prescribe. Then the next part, I would say that to be a really effective MDMA therapist, it does help to do MDMA, but also I'd say to do a wide range of other psychedelics as well, and to try to do your own psychotherapy without drugs is also. And then I think the other big question, and this is where I guess my view of the law comes into here. It's like, what do they think about doing above ground or underground research? Are they comfortable doing underground therapy? There's a lot of important work that needs to be done, and so I think one of the ways where Michael and I have had a different of opinion is to what we share to the therapists that are going through the MAPS training about whether they should do underground therapy or not. And so, well, I'll let you share your own view, but what I would say is that there's difference between what's legal and what's moral, and obviously, and that there's a lot of good that could be done with underground therapy as well as above ground therapy. And so the advice that I would give also is that it's interesting to think about, how do underground therapists get in trouble? And you normally think that an underground therapist would get in trouble because something would go wrong with the therapy and then the patient would complain. But that doesn't actually seem to be what happens. What happens is that underground therapists do good work and somebody changes and they make some changes in their life, and the people in their family or their friends or their religion that are left behind don't want to see this change, and then they contact the police or the authorities. So underground therapists get in trouble when the therapy goes well, but they haven't properly checked the social circumstances of the patient. So I would give that advice if you are going to do this underground work. I'd say you can also probably do both underground work and above ground work at the same time. You just have to be really careful who you tell what. But I would say that the main thing is to respond to suffering, and however you feel compelled to do that, go forward.
And I, of course, respect Rick's commitment to reducing suffering. And in most areas, we have a similar risk tolerance. I think that's one reason we've gotten along so well. But in this area, I've always been very grateful that there are many good underground therapists helping people while we're screwing around with the FDA. I'm not against underground therapy. I just thought it's not worth the risk for the regulatory, late in the game, having a problem from a MAPS therapist doing underground therapy while they're also doing the research. That was a little beyond my risk tolerance. And so we never got agreement on that, but Amy and Vera and I and Annie and I agreed. So we would tell the therapist, this is not a policy, Rick doesn't agree, but we all feel this way.
And just in terms of actual testing our risk estimates, so one of the therapists that worked with us did do underground therapy and did get complained by the people that, not the person, not the patient. And so what actually happened was FDA came, and the most important thing that the FDA checked on was the MDMA that was legal, was it diverted to the illegal? And once that did not happen, so then the FDA was done, and then there was various investigations, but the patient denied that the therapy took happen. So it didn't actually shut down the site, it didn't hurt the study, it didn't compromise the data, but that was just one incident.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a little close though, because I was a safety officer, so I had a number of interviews with these FDA, and they made the point, we want to be clear, we're not from the research arm of the FDA, we're from the enforcement arm. And there was also someone from the California enforcement arm. So what it came down to after about a year and a half, it was still periodically I'd hear from them, and then they finally said, would you sign an affidavit about, because I had talked to the therapist, so I knew quite a lot about it, would you sign an affidavit about what happened? And I said no, and that was the end of it.
Okay. Peter?
So my advice to ongoing psychedelic therapists would be become a trained psychotherapist in conventional method, and be aware that becoming a psychotherapist takes you 10 to 15 years to become a compassionate, competent, related, affectionate psychotherapist that can then, as an adult therapist, a therapy can use psychedelics. I think that's one of the basic prerequisites to be a good psychedelic therapist. You have to have a huge toolbox to, as Michael said, and I repeated in my talk, to construct for every patient the individual therapy. So that's my advice.
Thank you, Peter. Rabea?
I was a patient, so I don't have really specific views, but I am in agreement with what Peter said and how I experienced him as my therapist, how I would like to see other therapists to be, as Peter explained.
Okay, great. I have another question, and this is another one of mine. So I really wanted to understand what trip, what was that trip that you had in your life that made you decide, I want to commit the rest of my life to making sure psychedelics can benefit other patients? What was that trip, the pivotal trip that made you decide to dedicate your life to this pursuit?
I'll answer first.
Yes.
I mentioned Jörg Walter Roth this morning. And at that time, he was my supervisor in guided affection imagery. And the supervision group was sort of deteriorating, and I was the only one left then. And he said, I think I have something that could help you. And I was completely ignorant. I hardly could discern opioids from benzodiazepines. And he took me into an MDMA session. And it was literally turning the light on in my consciousness. And I was on the hook from then on.
Wow.
Yeah. And after that, he introduced me to the SAPT. And from there on, I went to psycholytic training of the SAPT and into research and compassionate use. So it was clear from the first moment that I wanted to follow this path.
What's the SAPT?
Swiss Medical Association for Psycholytic Therapy.
Yeah. Well, it was my first LSD trip, which turned out to be a very difficult experience. But I'll go back in time. This was when I was 17. But the big eye-opening for me was when I was 13 and I had my bar mitzvah. And I was expecting that my bar mitzvah was going to change me into a man. I'm the oldest of 4 kids. I had no older siblings to tell me it might not work that way. But I had this really great thought that I would go through this ceremony and then something would be different the next morning. I would be transformed somehow or other. And I woke up the next morning in bed and I'm like, I am the same as I was. I liked the party, but nothing really changed me on this internal way. And so I kept thinking, okay, God's busy. A lot of people got bar and bat mitzvah. Maybe it'll take 2 days. And then 2 days comes by, nothing happens. And then I'm like, okay, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. Then finally it's another week and a whole new crop of people all over the world got bar and bat mitzvah. And I figured I have just fallen off the list. Nothing's going to happen from this bar mitzvah. This rite of passage didn't really anchor it deep enough for me to think that it didn't do anything. So my first LSD trip was actually really difficult. I had a difficult time letting go. But I started thinking, who am I? Where do I really belong? What is my consciousness? What is it that I'm scared of? Why is it that these emotions that are coming up that I'm having a difficult time? I feel like the first LSD trip woke me up to my emotions, and in it I said, this is what my bar mitzvah should have been. And so that's what I thought. There's something really here about balancing me out and balancing the world out between our overdeveloped minds and our underdeveloped emotions and spirituality. And I thought LSD could be really helpful in that regard. And I'll just go back to one last thing before that, which was I grew up believing that LSD was terrible, that it caused chromosome damage, that it would... We were told that 5 or 6 times you take LSD, you're certifiably insane. And I believed all of that. And it was when I was 16, 17, just barely turning 17, I read a book, and I loved this book. And a friend of mine had given it to me, and I gave it back to him, and he said, the author of this book wrote part of it under LSD. And I'm like, that's impossible. Nothing good comes from LSD. And he said, no, check it out. And it turned out it was Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And he did write part of it under LSD. And that's what really cracked me open. Like, I must have been told false story, that something this incredibly powerful can derive in part from LSD, that maybe I've been misled. And so then when I tried LSD, even though it was a very difficult trip, there were these glimmers of a deeper consciousness and of emotions, and I thought, this is what I need to do more of.
Okay.
Well, I had a delayed reaction, I guess, but it did have to do with the difficult LSD trip. You know, and when I was in the late 60s and early 70s, when I was in college and then living on a hippie commune, I had quite a number of psychedelic experience, and I had a lot of really uplifting ones. You know, I had the experience of that Buddha expression, looking for the bull, and then you realize you're riding on it. You know, I had some wonderful experiences like that, and then I had a really terrifying experience where time stopped, and you know, it was terrifying and kept leaving my body. And you know, we had a vague idea about set and setting from Tim Leary, but happily a friend sat for me and I got through it. But then after that, every time I took a psychedelic, it was never like that, but some of that fear was always there. And so eventually I left it behind. I decided it's time to go something useful, went to medical school, and then I practiced emergency medicine for 10 years. And then the reason I went into psychiatry was because I was getting tired of emergency medicine. I was wondering what to do, and I found an article about Stan Grof. And so that's another connection with me and Rick. So when I got one of Stan Grof's books out of the medical school library, no one had ever checked it out before. And I read it and I thought, holy shit, there's a way to understand what happened. And so I applied to the holotropic breathwork training with Stan and the psychiatry residency. And I went to my first holotropic breathwork workshop. I took a vacation the first month of my psychiatry residency. And in that session, I resolved that the leftover fear in the holotropic breathwork session, I resolved the leftover fear from that LSD session. So it was clear to me, I thought we'd have to do it with just breath work for a long time, but that was clear to me, this is what I want to do, work with shifting consciousness for this kind of healing.
Okay.
I'd like to add something.
Yes.
You gave me the cue with the emotions. On my first MDMA experience, I realized that I didn't know what psychotherapy was. So I had a lot of concepts in my head, and the concepts sort of ran down to the heart, and I started to feel what psychotherapy is about. And that put me on the hook. So, yeah.
That's very profound. Rabiat, can you please share?
Yeah, I would like to share an example of a session that I called my breakthrough session with MDMA-assisted therapy. So the substance took me to my time as a police detective, particularly in a homicide unit, where the substance allowed me to go revisit all the homicides I did the crime scene of, including attending the autopsies and so on. So it was one victim after another, one by one, chronologically, and also how it made me feel, and also how it made the connection between being afraid of death, because I couldn't understand, like, I'm a homicide detective, but I'm afraid of death. It didn't make sense to me, but the substance made that connection. Also, the substance, I felt it was playing, I was always telling to Peter, it was playing ping pong with me, connecting, going to my childhood trauma to understand actually, no, the fear of death was not when you became a homicide detective, it was when you were 6 years old. Now let's go back to the homicide cases and let's process that and take you back to your childhood trauma. So I felt that ping pong effect was really interesting, how powerful the substance was and how I got so many connections, so much awareness. I could let go, I could process, I could speak about it, and I felt relieved. I felt like finally, after 7 years doing all the time crime scenes, I could really process all the victims and let the feelings of helplessness go. To me, it felt also that the substance hacked the password of my hard drive in my brain and told me, Rabia, here's the information. Now we're going to get everything out. So that's how powerful it was for me.
Wow. Absolutely. Wow. I want to open up questions on the floor to the audience for your questions, to ask questions to our panelists. So we're probably going to need, oh yes, you have that microphone. Who wants to go first?
Hi, thank you for everything you guys have said. I wanted to go back to one of your questions on how we can get more involved if we're more on the research side, because I'm an epidemiologist by trade, I guess. So I'm curious how I could get involved in like qualitative and quantitative data and analyzing, and not so much the therapy part.
Well, I think one of the big questions that has been in the past been slowing down the research is that government people and others have said, you know, if you make MDMA into a medicine or you make LSD into a medicine, it, quote, sends the wrong message to young people, that this is okay, and then you'll have more young people experimenting and they're going to get into trouble, and so there's been this resistance. So I think if you could do surveys, in a way, of people who do psychedelics illegally, and what are the consequences, and what are the things that they've learned to try to make the experiences turn out well, or how often is it damaging to people. I think that what's probably the case is that the vast majority of underground experiences are positive, or are, you know, struggles but don't really turn into anything bad. And occasionally, like we've just heard this story about, you know, the airline pilot that you know, blamed you know, his psilocybin experience several days before for making him feel like he wasn't really there and almost crashing a plane. And I described how this, you know, person at this party had a terrible experience with psilocybin and killed some people. So I think from a broad epidemiological perspective on broad population, because the only data that we can use for making substances into medicines are under controlled circumstances through research, I think the epidemiology can get at the broader use of psychedelics by the way most people are using it and the way the vast majority of psychedelics are being used. So that could be helpful for drug policy reform, or also for harm reduction methods. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there. Because as we are moving forward in the medicine, and as people are questioning the drug war, there is more and more of this thought about, you know, why should these be illegal? And so I think there could be epidemiological data that could support arguments about how this, if we do make it legal, how that should be done.
Before the next question, I just want, if you ask a question, just please say your name and the institution that you work on so that we know where you're from. That would be great.
Hi, my name is Vincent, depending which institution, ALPS or University of Freiburg, I guess. I have a question about MDMA therapy, in a sense, or the skills that a therapist should have, in your opinion. So what personality traits maybe, or skills do you think are fundamental to this kind of therapy? And or if there's a certain therapy school that you think is the most applicable to this kind of MDMA-assisted or generally psychedelic-assisted therapy? Was that understandable or not?
Who wants to answer that?
Was it understandable? Yeah. Okay.
When I started to get trained in psychotherapy, I went to a hypnotherapy course first, and I didn't really know what to learn, which kind of therapy, and I asked the woman who gave the course, and she said, it doesn't matter so much, just do anything that is fun and engage in it and learn it and then move on to the next method and you'll find your way. So that's how I did it. I know there is quite a debate about which psychotherapy method is the best for adding to psychedelic-assisted therapy. I'm not quite sure. I think it's more the fact that the older psychotherapists get and the more experience they get, the more similar they become in their interventions and how they handle difficult situations and how they relate to people. So eventually everybody who is gone through extensive training and has a lot of experience in psychotherapy ends up in the same place, relating to their patients in similar ways.
Could you say what those ways are?
Exactly, thank you.
Well, listening, the art of listening to people, to be in contact with people, to be compassionate, to be open to them, and yeah, for example.
Yeah, I agree with you, Peter. You know, when we do our trainings, we show a lot of video of sessions, and people see what happens and what we do. But what we start out by saying is, if we could show you these without showing you what we did, maybe that would be better. Because what we're wanting to demonstrate is these are the kinds of things that can happen. Sometimes very challenging things that I think do require real presence and some guidance and response from the therapist. But it's not about the specific way we happen to do it. It's about being aware that these things will happen, and if you can be present with whatever your skills are and whatever your personality is, as long as it's not interfering, you'll find your way to respond. So I think, like Peter, I've trained in many different kinds of therapy over the years, and I don't think one is better than the other as long as they're not getting in the way of the unfolding process. It's more like, okay, this happens to be a tool I have that allows me to engage with this person in this situation. And it doesn't mean that that's the only or the best tool, but it means because it resonates for me and I have experience, it works well to connect with people and offer, you know, we don't offer so much direction as suggestion or encouragement to see if it makes sense to them. So it's kind of the same thing you're talking about, I think, Peter.
Yeah, I'd say that the most important thing would be, can a therapist sit with someone who's going through a lot of pain and emotional pain and fear and be able to not be triggered themselves with their own anxieties and fears? Can you calmly kind of be there and be a witness to pain and suffering without feeling like you have to stop them from doing that or interfere, that they have to go through that? But can you peacefully witness the emergence of pain and suffering and see it in a releasing, healing process rather than something that makes you want to turn away yourself because it's triggering your own thing? So it's that constant ability to kind of quietly give people confidence that they can face the pain within them and that you can bear witness as they're doing that.
Yeah, I'll say that my wife Annie is a nurse, and she doesn't have all that much therapy training. She's trained with Stan Grof and also has a Comey training, but she has experience as a hospice volunteer and as a nurse. And you know, nurses have a lot of experience of staying with people in intense states for long hours. So in a way, that's maybe more important than a specific therapy method.
Okay, I'll try to be quick so everybody else gets their chance. Alex Upli, Tampere University, Finland, and A-Clinic. When you get MDMA-assisted psychotherapy approved for PTSD by the FDA and then the EMA, would that also allow sort of off-label use for other indications than just PTSD?
Yes, so the FDA, the EMA, they don't regulate the practice of medicine. I think the problem is going to be is that insurance coverage, at least in the US, will be for PTSD, but it won't be for other indications until more research is done. for those other indications to get the FDA to approve that. And so I think the price of the medicine and the price of the therapy where insurance doesn't cover it will be the main limiting factor, making it so that off-label use is pretty minimal, I think, because it will be, there are a bunch of people that can pay for it themselves, and so there will be some of that self-pay, but I think for the most part, it will be very difficult for people to pay for it. And so, but the main thing to say also about the therapy is that once people have demonstrated that they understand the self-directed therapy that we teach, then when they go to practice, they don't have to follow that. So in a sense that it could be, it's not, the label will not probably say that MDMA-assisted therapy in this way, by this treatment manual, is the only thing that's approved. But even if it says that, people can practice different kind of therapies, and I think insurance will still cover it if it's just for PTSD. But in 1986, when Marinol, the oral THC pill, was developed as a medicine for nausea control and cancer chemotherapy, the DEA proposed a final rule that would limit off-label prescriptions because it was a controlled substance. And there was so much outcry from the pharmaceutical industry and from pharmacy associations that the DEA had to withdraw that rule. So even though it's controlled substances, there's really no way that they can block off-label prescription.
Another question?
Hello, I'm Adam from the University of Fribourg, and I wanted to ask you, as many people will have to be trained in psychedelic therapy in the next years, to what extent is it important to create safeguards against like egotic inflation, spiritual bypass, things of the sort in the training of people? Like, to what extent is this a concern for you? And if safeguards would need to be applied in one way or the other, like what would they be if that was the case? Thank you.
He's going to get that one.
Well, I have less concern about that with MDMA than maybe with other psychedelics, but I don't know what to do about that. I think well, I think two things about it. It's a way of avoiding working with things that they don't want to work with, and it's also a self-protective mechanism, in a way. Maybe there's a reason why they're not ready to engage with those things too. So I think spiritual bypass can be a problem, but I also want to be respectful of where that person is and where they're ready to go at that time.
Well, the final part of our training, which is as people work with their first PTSD patient and everything's videotaped, and then we have adherence raters that watch the videotapes and kind of give feedback to people on how well they're practicing the method that we've been trying to teach them, and then the supervisors talk to them. That's very minimal because it'll only be for the first patient, and if there are some concerns, then they may watch videotapes for the second patient. But in view of the large number of therapists that we want to train and the limited number of supervisors and adherence raters, I don't know if some of these things would be picked up, but we're most concerned that they end up both being there to support the patient, and then the other big part that we try to teach in the therapy, and I think, again, Michael's quote about that, was that we're trying to really help people to empower them to heal themselves. So I think the biggest thing that I would worry about is the therapists who are like, I'm the one doing this to you, I am the healing agent, rather than you are the healing agent, I am helping to provide a safe place, and the MDMA is helping you deal with difficult emotions. So this kind of, again, that's hard to pick up in the training program for sure, but I think that's the most concern for me, is that the power dynamics and the whole way in which we want to make this durable for people to continue to do the healing process even without the MDMA is to help them understand that they are the one that is healing themselves by having the courage to look at these difficult emotions, by letting their emotions out. And so if therapists are wanting to be like, I'm the one that's doing this. That's the thing I'd worry about more than spiritual bypassing, even just that them wanting to be the agent of change themselves, which disempowers the patient themselves.
Yeah, and there's also the danger that the therapist will think it's about them too, and get inflated and get into trouble that way.
We have room for 2 more questions, and I see a lot of hands up. Yep.
Yeah, and somebody asked a few minutes ago what would be the best school of psychology to study if you want to become a psychedelic therapist. And surely this is a very important question, because each school of psychology is a map of the psyche and the universe, and some of them are obsolete. I mean, I would say if you want to become a psychedelic therapist, don't study behaviorism, or don't become a Freudian psychiatrist, because in the evolution of science, in a certain sense, Freud opened the door in Western Europe to the idea of the unconscious, and then Jung stood on the shoulders of Freud and looked further, and then you could say that Stan Grof and the transpersonal movement looked much further. So I would say look at the transpersonal psychological, psychiatric sphere if you want to become a psychedelic psychotherapist.
Yeah, I'd completely agree. So back in 1982, when I returned to college after dropping out for 10 years, preparing myself to study psychotherapy, I developed a curriculum for myself for 4 years to become a psychedelic therapist. And what I found was that the education for transpersonal psychology was, for me, the most relevant school of thought to understand, because it permits you to understand the range of experiences that are possible that MDMA and other psychedelics can reveal. And then also, at the time, people were much more comfortable when I said, oh, I'm studying transpersonal psychology, rather than I'm studying, to be a psychedelic therapist. But transpersonal psychology was really developed by Abraham Maslow and Stan Grof and others in the late 60s, early 70s, in confrontation with the findings from psychedelic research. So it really is, I think, the best match, theoretically, for what goes on in psychedelic sessions.
Thank you. Tadeusz, Psychedelic Access and Research European Alliance. I think it's really wonderful that there is so much emphasis put here on therapy and throughout the conference, but when I'm also looking around at what's out there in terms of drug developers, I see a lot of, the main ones really, I see a lot of kind of basic protocols where there is just psychological support and safeguarding. So, Rick, you had this nice slide at some point showing, the future where there are different compounds and people come and choose, but I'm afraid, or I think that behind these different labels or doors can be very different models. So I guess we know what's best, what's the most optimal, but if you were to take out a crystal ball and kind of think what the future will bring in terms of based on what we see now in different protocols from other developers, what would that be?
Well, I guess I'm not quite sure your question. So what would psychedelic clinics look like, or what range of things would therapists do, or what would the training for them to be?
Yeah, based on what we see from other major companies that are developing psychedelic therapies, which are not necessarily psychedelic-assisted therapies, and they have, safeguarding and very basic psychological support. How do you think the future will be? You have one formula with a lot of therapy, but I don't see this all that much with other developers. So how do you think these dynamics will play out in the future between different models?
Yeah, well, okay, so I think that therapists are going to use the techniques and the substances for which they see the greatest benefit in their patients. And I think this Compass Pathways just put out a paper about how you don't really need therapists. You just need psychological support while they're doing the psilocybin, which seems to me to be a business kind of a decision to try to make it low cost and covered by national health insurance. But I think that therapists over time will explore more and more of the sort of innovative techniques, because the therapists are not really interested in selling more drugs. I mean, the different companies want to sell different drugs, but the therapists just want the patients to get better. And so they will gravitate towards the substances and the therapeutic approaches that permit them to do the best that they can with their patients. So I think even though companies will want to spend time, particularly if we get these insurance models that will pay for longer psychedelic sessions, the other part is that the outcomes are, the way the insurance is going to be reimbursable for different things is they look at the outcomes and they value all sorts of ways in which the outcomes help the individual, reduce medical costs, help the families, help them get back to work, help the countries, they pay more taxes, they get back to work, and things like that. So that I think that the approaches that involve more therapy, I think, will get better outcomes and will be reimbursed by national health care and stuff. So I think it'll gravitate towards where the therapists feel they're getting the most benefit. So that would be the kind of insurance, you could say, against pharma companies trying to minimize therapy and just get it out there. And so the best example for us right now is ketamine. So ketamine being approved without therapy at all, as ketamine and Spravato, and there are clinics that do that, but more and more of the ketamine clinics are combining therapy with ketamine, and then the clinics actually make more money. They provide more therapy. That money doesn't go to the pharma companies, but the clinics have seen that this makes the outcomes better. So that's the hope.
Yeah, and I think like that Goodwin paper saying it's all about the medicine, I think you're going to find out it's not. When it gets into practice, they're going to find out the reality.
So I know we have a ton of questions, but we are at 7:30. I think Morten said I could have a few more minutes, so I'll just have one question. So I'm just going to let the person with the microphone decide who that's going to be. Sorry about that. Oh, thank you.
I wanted to thank you all for such wonderful presentations that you've made over the last few days. I have a question which I've been seeing for the last couple of days, little indications coming out here and there, but no direct addressing of the question. I'm just wondering how much influence has the radical psychology movement had on the development of psychedelic therapies, psychedelic-assisted therapies? Is there any feeling on your part whether, in fact, you may be familiar with some of the books by Phil Brown, for instance, The Radical Therapist, etc. Has that opened doors in any way for some of the background and the philosophy of psychedelic-assisted therapy? Thank you.
I'll just say that I'm pretty unaware of what radical psychology or psychotherapy really is. So I haven't read those books, and so I'd be curious to learn more, but at least from my quick sense, I don't know that there's been that much influence. Maybe you could describe a bit more what it is.
Excuse me?
Could you describe a bit more what are the perspectives?
Well, this is, okay, this came out of the social movements back in the early 70s, late 60s. You had Your Perfect Right was a book which was talking about self-assertiveness training, for example. It was marginal. I had my psychology and anthropology studies in the early 70s. So these were marginal movements within the psychology. It grew out of Thomas Szasz' work a lot in anti-psychiatry, R.D. Laing, and a few other therapists.
Well, I would say that R.D. Laing has had a big influence because he was basically saying, don't interrupt the process. A lot of the psychosis is a natural process that will evolve. Don't try to squash it. You know, he provided places for people to be supported as they work through schizophrenia or psychosis or major mental illness. So I think the attitude of let things evolve and let them develop rather than try to reduce the symptoms, let them move forward, I think is a key aspect for the psychedelic psychotherapies. And so R.D. Laing, I think, did have a big influence.
It certainly influenced me. I mean, in the 60s, everybody was reading R.D. Laing, and it was very, it resonated a lot. I'm not sure how much the younger therapists are into that now. I don't really know.
Yeah, I think the reason I pose this question is because I've seen in a lot of discussion some of the philosophy that was coming out of the radical therapy movement in some of your presentations. I notice that we're all old hippies here, so that's one of the reasons why I would even ask that question.
Let's have one last question. Oh my gosh. Inny, miny, miny, mo, catch a tiger by the toe.
Yeah. Bettina Wawitz, I'm a member of the SEPT, and I have a more political question. I think in the 60s there was with the Psychedelic movement, there was also a political movement for peace. And I think that had a big impact on the Vietnam War, and that peace got a chance at that time from the basic people who enforced, who put pressure on the government. And with the psychedelic renaissance, I hope that there would be also a peace movement like this. We have so many wars right now, but I don't see this movement. I don't know whether you share this observation, and I wonder how it comes, because there are so many people using the substances also without therapy in recreational use in raves, and so I wonder how comes that this doesn't lead to a big peace movement again. Do you have an explanation, or do you share the observation?
I share the observation, but I don't have an explanation. Yeah, for me, working to stop the Vietnam War and psychedelics occurred at the same time of my life and kind of went hand in hand. And so I do wonder, we need that again, I think, but I don't know.
Well, I like political questions. But I don't think it necessarily means that the people that were against the Vietnam War were pacifists. So my sense was I was not a conscientious objector because I'm not against all wars. Sometimes I think it's important to defend yourselves. So where would we see it? Right now, I see Russia has moved into Ukraine in a way that's imperialistic, and so I think the war against Russia is important, and so support the Ukrainians is important. So I don't know, what would a peace movement, where would you see this, I guess? I think that most of the people that have been influenced by psychedelics would rather engage in dialogue, would rather, try to find common ground. There is all of that, but it was the Vietnam War that was particularly supporting dictators. It was an imperialistic war of conquest that was a terrible idea, and it had terrible consequences, and millions of Vietnamese died. So I think that peace movement wasn't the same as let's all become Quakers and be, pacifists. So I think the idea of trying to understand other cultures and to try to find peaceful ways, it's there.
I do have one thought. In the Vietnam War, there was a draft. So now there's no draft. There's a, quote, volunteer army, which means people who are in difficult financial situations and have no prospects get paid to go fight the war. So it is true that as much as we, in the 60s, that we, felt the war was wrong for altruistic reasons, it was also self-preservation, because I ended up with a high draft number, but my friends were getting drafted out of college and dying in Vietnam. So it certainly lit a fire under us that there was a draft. So there's a problem with kind of segregating the military. Not that I want to draft again, but I think that was a factor probably.
Although I would just say that I do think a draft would be a good idea, because when you have a volunteer army, there's less friction in society if the political people send them off to war. But if everybody has to be involved, so I think there could be some people that would rather have national service other than the military. I think that there should be a national service in the United States, and you either go in the military or you do other kinds of things. And I think that would also check the warmongering among political leaders. But I do think still that a lot of the people inspired by psychedelics are moving in more peaceful directions, and would rather, once you can navigate your own emotions, you can handle high conflict issues without it turning into violence. You can kind of navigate a little bit better the conflicts that do occur.
Okay, everybody, we are at the end of the session. Oh, sorry, Peter, I'm sorry. Sorry, cut off your mic. Did she come back?
I think these are different times now. We can't really compare the 60s with the developments we have in this modern world. What I observe is that psychedelics are connecting people who think and feel likewise all over the world. So it's more of a network building of people who are also willing to engage in peace initiatives, but maybe on a smaller scale, in local communities, in families, in your own personal environment. That's what I can see.
So we are at the end of the session, but I do have a little question. Martin, is that okay? A little one of my questions. And so the idea is, if you were a fairy or an elf, and you had like one wish with regards to psychedelics, just one single wish, no, not 3 wishes, just one wish, what would that wish be? That it would happen like tomorrow. You'd make the wish now, and tomorrow the wish would be fulfilled. What would it be?
Suddenly everyone would stop projecting their shadow onto others.
Well, because this therapy has recovered me from PTSD, the wish I have is that other people could also heal just like I healed.
Well, when my wife and I have 3 kids, and when each of them turned 13 at the bar bat mitzvah age, we said to them, we think you're old enough for MDMA or marijuana, and if you want any, come to us and we'll do it together. We didn't realize that was the best anti-drug thing we could have done, because they were like, no way, do drugs with my parents? No, we're not ready. But my wish would be that there would be immediately a legal context for people to educate their own children with psychedelics if they wanted to, at whatever age they wanted to. And I think bringing it into the family is the way that the indigenous cultures tend to do it, and the families and the cultures. So I think if we were to say, oh, there may be drug laws, but they generally are for adults only if there's legal access, but then we would have a parental override of all drug laws so parents could educate their children the way they wanted to do it.
Wow.
I wish there would be more connection between people, between strangers, between nations, between the people we don't know, to get together and to drive on this psychedelic renaissance.
I truly want to thank you all from the very bottom of my heart for being on this panel today, for being so candid, so authentic, for talking about your experiences, and for connecting with every single one of us in this room. Thank you very, very, very much.
Thank you, Rebecca.